December 18th, 1944. Inside a frozen dirt hole near Bastogne, Corporal Eddie Voss pressed his headphones tighter against his frozen ears. Through the scratchy, crackling sound, he heard something that made his heart freeze. A German tank commander was giving directions, not to his own tanks, but to American positions. Eddie's hand moved over the send button. He'd been told never to talk on enemy radio channels, a crime that could get him punished by military court. But 300 men were sleeping 2 miles west, right where those tanks were going. Eddie closed his eyes, opened his mouth, and spoke perfect German into the emptiness. This is the story of how one radio operator saved a group of soldiers by breaking every rule, and why the Army tried to hide what happened next. Before we go further, if you love unknown stories of secret wartime cleverness, hit that subscribe button. You won't find these stories anywhere else. Eddie Voss wasn't supposed to be listening. The U.S. Army Signal Corps had strict rules about radio watching. Operators were given specific friendly radio channels. They passed messages up the command chain. They took care of the equipment. What they did not do was tune into enemy messages without permission from information officers. The reasons made sense. First, it wasted time and supplies on chatter that trained questioners should handle. Second, it risked operators being fed fake information. Third, and most importantly, it could lead to people responding without permission, which could put everyone in danger. But Eddie had never been good at following rules he didn't understand. He'd grown up in Milwaukee, the son of German parents who'd left Europe in 1923. His parents spoke German at home until Pearl Harbor made it unsafe. Eddie learned the language at his grandmother's side, learning not just words but sayings, local ways of speaking, the special sound of Prussian German compared to Bavarian German. By the time he joined the Army in 1943, he could copy accents from Hamburg to Munich. The Army tested his German during basic training. They marked him as speaking it well and assigned him to signals information work. But instead of sending him to a comfortable desk job in London, translating messages, some paperwork mistake landed him with the 101st Airborne as a field radio operator. He fixed equipment, he passed along directions, he spent most of his time cold, wet, and bored, until the Bulge. When Hitler started his desperate winter attack on December 16th, the American lines broke apart. Entire groups of soldiers were surrounded. Communication systems fell apart. In the mess, Eddie found himself in a dirt hole outside Bastogne with a working SCR 300 radio, a pair of good quality headphones taken from a destroyed German half-track, and nothing but time. So he started listening. At first, it was just interest. He turned the dial through the spectrum, picking up pieces of German chatter. Tank crews reporting where they were. Foot soldiers calling for bullets. Artillery watchers adjusting fire. Nothing he could use. Nothing he could do anything about. Just voices in the dark. Men speaking his grandmother's language while trying to kill his friends. But Eddie had a gift. Not for languages, though that helped. He had a gift for patterns. Before the war, he'd worked for Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company as a problem solver. When electrical systems broke, Eddie would listen not to what people said was wrong, but to the hum of the equipment itself. Transformers had rhythms, circuit breakers had personalities. He could hear problems before they became really bad. Now sitting in frozen Belgian mud with German voices crackling through his headset, Eddie began to hear patterns again. There was a tank commander who always said "Moment Mal" before giving directions, an artillery spotter who said "Feuer" with a slight lisp, a supply officer who ended every message with "Ende" in a bored, flat voice. Eddie started taking notes. He drew rough maps based on unit names he heard. He wrote down message times, frequencies, call signs. Within 3 days, he could recognize individual German operators by voice alone. He knew which tank group was working northeast of Bastogne. He knew their fuel situation was really bad. He knew their commander was careful, organized, and terrified of mines. On the fourth night, December 18th, Eddie heard something that made him sit up straight. The careful tank commander, the one with the smoker's rough voice, was getting new orders. Eddie's pencil flew across his notepad as he wrote down the words. The words were normal, military, professional, but their meaning was terrible. The German column was being sent to a new place. New target, a fuel storage place 2 miles west. The same storage place currently surrounded by American foot soldiers who had no idea they were about to be crushed by 40 tanks. Eddie's hands shook as he looked at his notes. He needed to warn someone. He reached for his radio to call headquarters, then stopped. His orders were clear. Monitor friendly frequencies only. Report through proper channels. Do not talk with or respond to enemy communications under any circumstances. But proper channels took time, checking, approval chains. By the time his warning crawled up to someone who could act on it, the German tanks would already be rolling through American dirt holes. Eddie stared at the captured German radio set in the corner of his dirt hole. It had been sitting there for 2 days, pulled from a destroyed SDKFZ 251 half-track. He'd kept it thinking maybe information officers would want it, but information officers were miles away, and the tanks were moving now. Eddie made a decision that would change everything. He reached for the German radio and began adjusting frequencies, because sometimes the only way to save lives was to become the enemy. Eddie had been listening to the tank commander for 72 hours straight, and in that time the man had become more real to him than most of his own squad. He knew the commander's rhythms, the slight pause before announcing directions, as if double-checking a map. The way he said "ja" with a downward sound when agreeing to orders he disagreed with. The barely heard sigh when his bosses demanded impossible timelines. The commander's call sign was Eisenfaust 4, Iron Fist 4. But Eddie had started thinking of him as Klaus. There was no reason to believe his name was Klaus. It just felt right. Klaus sounded tired. Klaus sounded skilled. Klaus sounded like a man who'd been fighting too long and wanted to go home, but would do his duty anyway, because that's what men like Klaus did. Understanding Klaus wasn't just curiosity. Eddie had realized something important about German radio discipline, or rather the lack of it. The Wehrmacht's communication rules were strict, organized by rank, and terrifyingly well-working under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. The Battle of the Bulge had stretched German supplies to the breaking point. Radio operators were exhausted. Equipment was breaking. And in their desperation to stay organized, the Germans had started cutting corners. They rarely checked messages with proper code sequences anymore. There wasn't time. Instead, they relied on recognition, on knowing their officers' voices, on the familiar rhythm of orders delivered in the same way they'd heard 1,000 times before. It was faster, it was practical, and it was a huge weakness if someone like Eddie happened to be listening. Eddie had filled an entire notebook with observations. He'd mapped the message schedule. The Germans followed predictable patterns. Klaus usually got orders between 2 and 3 in the morning. His radio operator had a clear click when he turned on the transmitter, probably a worn-out part in the press-to-talk switch. The officer giving Klaus his orders always began with the same phrase, Eisenfaust 4, hier Panzergruppe Kommando. More importantly, Eddie had identified the emotional patterns. Klaus was confident when discussing defensive positions. He became unsure when orders required aggressive movement in uncertain ground. And he was absolutely paranoid about mines. Every time orders took his column through unfamiliar territory, Klaus would request clarification. Is the route checked? Is the route verified? He'd ask it twice, sometimes 3 times. That fear made sense. Eddie had heard enough radio chatter to know Klaus had lost 2 tanks to American minefields in the past week. Good tanks, experienced crews, gone in seconds because some information officer misread a map or ignored a scouting report. Klaus wasn't going to let that happen again if he could help it. But there was something else Eddie noticed. Something subtle. When Klaus received orders, he trusted from officers he knew. His responses were quick and immediate. But when orders came from unfamiliar call signs or seemed questionable, there was hesitation, a pause, a request for confirmation. Klaus was professional, but he wasn't blindly obedient. He questioned things, carefully, respectfully, but he questioned. That should have made Eddie's plan impossible. How could he fool a man who questioned his own bosses? But Eddie understood something about psychology that most people missed. Suspicious people aren't suspicious of everything equally. They're suspicious of unusual things, of things that don't fit the pattern. But if you match the pattern perfectly, if you sound exactly like what they expect to hear, suspicion never triggers. The brain simply accepts the familiar and moves on. Eddie had been running imaginary situations in his head for days. What if he could send orders that sounded exactly like the ones Klaus expected? What if the call sign was right, the format correct, the accent perfect? What if the orders themselves made military sense, just subtly redirected? Klaus wouldn't question familiar patterns delivered in familiar ways. He'd simply obey. The moral weight of what Eddie was considering grew heavier with each hour. He wouldn't just be breaking army rules. He'd be engaging in mind warfare without permission, potentially putting information operations at risk, and risking terrible consequences if he failed. If the Germans detected the trick and found his position, they'd rain artillery on his dirt hole until there was nothing left but a smoking crater. But more than that, Eddie was planning to deceive a man he'd come to understand, maybe even respect. Klaus was the enemy. Klaus's tanks would kill Americans if given the chance. But Klaus was also a human being, a professional soldier doing his job. And Eddie was about to use his fear about minefields to send him to his death. Eddie stared at his notes as snow began falling again outside his dirt hole. The moral math was simple and horrible. Klaus and his tanks versus 300 American foot soldiers who had no idea they were about to be destroyed. There was no good choice. There was only the choice that saved the most lives on his side. On the evening of December 18th, Eddie's moral debate became pointless. His command made the decision for him. Captain Morrison appeared at his dirt hole with 2 military police and a stone. Someone had noticed Eddie's unauthorized monitoring. Someone had reported it up the chain. And now everything was about to fall apart. Captain Morrison didn't waste time with pleasantries. He stood at the edge of Eddie's dirt hole, snowflakes gathering on his shoulders, and held out his hand. "Give me the headset, Corporal." Eddie's stomach dropped. He pulled the headphones off slowly, the German voices still crackling faintly through the speakers. "Sir, I can explain. You've been monitoring enemy frequencies without permission for 4 days." Morrison's voice was flat, controlled, the kind of control that came before explosions. "You filled notebooks with information you had no clearance to collect, and you've been using a captured enemy radio set without reporting it to command." One of the MPs climbed down into the dirt hole and began disconnecting Eddie's equipment. The SCR-300 went first, then the German headphones, then the precious notebook filled with 4 days of observations. Eddie watched his work disappear into an equipment bag like watching someone take apart his life. "Sir, you don't understand. There's a tank column." "I understand perfectly, Corporal." Morrison cut him off. "You're a radio operator, not an information analyst. We have trained personnel for signal interpretation. What you've been doing is dangerous, unauthorized, and potentially putting operations at risk." Eddie's mind raced. He needed to make Morrison understand. "There's a German commander, call sign Eisenfaust 4. He's been receiving orders tonight. He's moving on the fuel storage place west of here. 300 men are sleeping there right now with no idea." "Enough!" Morrison's jaw tightened. "Do you have any idea how many false reports information officers receive every day from well-meaning soldiers who think they've cracked the German code? Every private who speaks a little German thinks he's going to win the war from a dirt hole." "This isn't false, sir. I've been tracking him for—" "You've been listening to radio chatter you're not trained to properly understand." Morrison gestured to the MP, who was now collecting the captured German radio. "For all you know, you've been listening to a trick operation. The Germans know we monitor their frequencies. They feed us fake information constantly." Eddie felt something breaking inside him. Not anger, something colder. The realization that Morrison wasn't going to listen, wasn't going to check, wasn't going to do anything except follow the rules. "Sir, please just verify the information. Send a runner to the storage place. Tell them to expect contact. That's all I'm asking." Morrison studied Eddie for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was almost gentle. "Voss, you're a good radio operator. You've kept our communications running under impossible conditions. But you've crossed a line. You will stop all monitoring of enemy frequencies immediately. You will not discuss your unauthorized information gathering with anyone. And if I hear you've touched enemy equipment again, I will have you court-martialed. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." The words tasted like ash. "Good. Get some sleep. You look like hell." Morrison turned and climbed out of the dirt hole, the MPs following with Eddie's taken equipment. Eddie sat in the sudden silence of his dirt hole, feeling the weight of helplessness. The German radio was gone. His notes were gone. His ability to monitor Klaus's messages was gone. And somewhere out in the darkness, 40 German tanks were preparing to roll over 300 sleeping Americans. He tried to tell himself Morrison would follow up, that information officers would check the threat, that the system would work the way it was supposed to work, but Eddie had been in the Army long enough to know better. Morrison would file a report. The report would be added to a stack of other reports. Information officers would prioritize threats based on source reliability, and an unauthorized corporal's warning would rank somewhere below believable. The snow fell harder now, muffling sounds, turning the world into a black and white painting. Eddie pulled his coat tighter and tried to think. There had to be a way, some proper channel he hadn't considered, some officer who would listen. Then he heard it. Voices. American voices drifting from a supply trench 30 yards away. 2 officers talking as they passed. Eddie couldn't see them through the snow, but sound carried in the cold night air. Pulled every available man for the defense edge. Fuel storage place is practically empty now. Smart. If the Germans break through, better to have the men than the diesel, assuming the Germans even know where it is. That area's been quiet for 2 days. The voices faded. Eddie sat very still, processing what he'd just heard. The fuel storage place wasn't just undefended. It had been purposely stripped of personnel. Command had gambled that the Germans didn't know its location. They'd bet 300 lives on the enemy staying ignorant. But Klaus knew. Eddie had heard the directions himself. And in approximately 4 hours, Klaus would receive his final orders, and 40 tank vehicles would turn west toward men who'd been purposely left exposed. Eddie looked at the corner of his dirt hole where the captured German radio had sat. Gone now, taken away, locked away somewhere, but not destroyed. Equipment like that would be sent to information officers for study, which meant it was still on base somewhere. Eddie had never stolen anything in his life. He'd never directly disobeyed an order. He was the son of immigrants who taught him to follow rules, work hard, keep his head down. But sitting in that frozen dirt hole, knowing what he knew, Eddie realized that all his life he'd been preparing for this moment, the moment when following rules meant watching people die. He waited until 12:30 in the morning, until the guard rotations changed, until tiredness and cold dulled the attention of men who'd been fighting for weeks. Then Eddie climbed out of his dirt hole and disappeared into the snow. The supply storage area was a collection of canvas tents and wooden crates arranged in what hopeful planners called organization. Eddie moved between the shadows, his breath forming small clouds that disappeared in the falling snow. He'd spent 3 months on this base. He knew which paths the guards walked. He knew which tents held ammunition and which held equipment waiting for information officers to review. The captured German radio would be in the CI tent, counterintelligence, a fancy storage area where taken enemy equipment sat waiting for someone with proper clearance to examine it. The tent was guarded, but not heavily. Who would steal a broken radio in the middle of a war? Eddie crouched behind a supply crate and watched the guard, young kid, probably 19, stamping his feet against the cold. Every few minutes, he'd turn and walk 10 paces in the other direction to keep his blood moving. 10 paces away from the tent entrance. 10 paces of opportunity. Eddie waited for the turn, then moved. He slipped under the tent flap and found himself in organized chaos. Pistols, binoculars, helmets, maps, all tagged and cataloged. And in the corner, his German radio sitting in a crate marked for transport to London. He grabbed it and was out in 15 seconds. Back in his dirt hole, Eddie's hands shook as he checked the radio. Still working. The Germans built equipment to last. He extended the antenna carefully, checking for damage. None. The battery level was low but good enough. He had maybe 2 hours of message time before the power died completely. Eddie pulled out a scrap of paper and began writing. Not the message itself. He couldn't write this out. If he sounded like he was reading, Klaus would know instantly. Instead, Eddie wrote sound guides, reminders of how tank group command officers structured orders, the rhythm, the formal military phrasing, the specific words. Eisenfaust 4, hier Panzergruppe. No. Iron Fist 4, this is tank group command. New orders. Eddie whispered the phrase over and over, adjusting his accent. Too sharp and he'd sound Bavarian. Too soft and he'd sound Austrian. Klaus's command structure was Prussian, Northern German. The accent had to be Berlin, maybe Hamburg, clipped consonants, precise vowels. He practiced the commander's speaking pattern. Tank group officers were former upper class mostly. They spoke with the confidence of men used to being obeyed. Not loud, volume wasn't authority, but absolute certainty. Every word delivered as undeniable fact. Eddie recorded his practice runs in his head, listening for mistakes. He sounded close, but not perfect. The problem was obvious. He'd learned German from his grandmother, from shopkeepers, from working-class immigrants. He'd never learned the upper-class military way of speaking. He was trying to copy a social class he'd never belonged to. But he'd spent 4 days listening to Klaus's actual commanders. He could hear their voices in his memory, the particular way they pronounced Koordinaten, the slight emphasis on the second syllable of Angriffsroute. Eddie closed his eyes and let those voices wash over him until his own voice began to match. The technical part was simpler. Eddie needed to know the exact frequency Klaus would be monitoring. That information was in his taken notebook, but he'd memorized the key frequencies days ago. 43.4 megahertz, the standard tank group command channel. The harder question was timing. Too early, and Klaus might receive different orders from his actual command. Too late, and the tanks would already be moving toward the fuel storage place. Eddie needed to send during the narrow window when Klaus expected orders, but before the real orders arrived. Based on 4 days of observation, that window opened at 2:17 in the morning. Klaus's actual orders usually came between 2:30 and 2:45. Eddie would have roughly 15 minutes to broadcast fake orders, have Klaus acknowledge them, and get off the air before the real tank group command came through. 15 minutes to save 300 lives or destroy his own. Eddie checked his watch. 2:03 in the morning. 14 minutes until he committed the most serious breaking of military law short of running away, pretending to be enemy command, broadcasting on enemy frequencies without permission, conducting unauthorized mind operations. If caught, Eddie would face court-martial, imprisonment, possibly execution, depending on how the military court interpreted his actions. But if he succeeded, 300 men would wake up alive tomorrow, and 40 German tanks would drive straight into American minefields based on orders from a voice that didn't exist. Eddie adjusted the frequency dial with numb fingers. The radio crackled to life, German voices bleeding through the static. Somewhere in that electronic chaos, Klaus was listening, waiting for orders he didn't know were about to come from a dirt hole 2 miles away. Eddie pulled his coat tighter and began his final preparation. He whispered German commands into the darkness, feeling the words shape his mouth, his throat, his accent. He imagined he was the commander, Prussian upper class, tired but professional, delivering orders that would never be questioned because they sounded exactly like every order Klaus had ever received. At 2:16 in the morning, Eddie picked up the microphone. His hand was steady now. The fear had burned away, replaced by cold focus. He was about to speak, and the world would change. He pressed the transmitter and waited for the red light. When it glowed, Eddie opened his mouth and became someone else entirely. Eisenfaust 4, hier Panzergruppe Kommando. Eddie's voice cut through the static with the precision of a blade. He'd pitched it slightly deeper than his natural register, adding the rough authority of a man who'd spent 20 years commanding tanks. The German words felt strange in his mouth, not because he didn't speak the language, but because he was weaponizing it. Silence. 5 seconds of nothing but atmospheric hiss. Eddie's heart hammered against his ribs. Maybe Klaus wasn't monitoring yet. Maybe the frequency was wrong. Maybe Panzergruppe Kommando. Hier Eisenfaust 4 bereit. Klaus's voice, the smoker's rasp. Eddie nearly dropped the microphone in relief. Tank Group Command, this is Iron Fist 4. Ready to receive. Eddie forced himself to pause. Real commanders didn't rush. They spoke with the certainty of men whose words would be obeyed without question. He counted 3 seconds, then pressed the transmitter again. Eisenfaust 4, Neue Befehle, Iron Fist 4, new orders. Your current attack route is being changed. Another pause. Eddie could hear Klaus breathing on the other end. That detail sent ice down his spine. He'd listened to this man for so long that now, separated by miles of frozen forest and the thin membrane of radio waves, Eddie could sense his confusion. Verstanden. Mehr Grund für die Änderung? Understood. More reason for the change? Klaus was questioning, not refusing, just seeking clarification. This was the moment, the turning point where Eddie's performance would either convince or condemn. He needed to give Klaus a reason that made military sense, aligned with German operation rules, and most importantly, triggered Klaus's deepest fear. Aerial reconnaissance has identified minefields along your original route. American engineers have strengthened defensive positions in the last 12 hours. Eddie held his breath. Mines. The word that made Klaus hesitate every single time. The trauma of watching crews burned alive by buried explosives. Eddie was using that trauma, manipulating it, using a man's fear to send him toward death. The pause lasted 7 seconds. Eddie counted everyone. He could imagine Klaus in his command tank, looking at maps, weighing the information against his orders. Suspicious people weren't suspicious of everything equally. They were suspicious of unusual things. But this wasn't unusual. This was exactly the kind of last-minute military adjustment that happened constantly in fluid combat. Neue route, bitte. New route, please. Eddie's hands shook as he reached for his makeshift map. He'd memorized the directions of American minefields northeast of their position. Real minefields laid by real engineers. He was about to send Klaus directly into them. Except Klaus would believe he was being routed around American defenses, not into them. Kursreferenz ändern. Change course reference to course 035. Reference point Hartmann 7. New target coordinates to follow. Eddie rattled off a series of grid references, each one carefully chosen, each one leading Klaus's column exactly where it needed to go. Not toward the fuel storage place, not toward 300 sleeping Americans, toward ground that hadn't been fought over because both sides knew it was deadly. Koordinaten bestätigt. Und das neue Ziel? Coordinates confirmed. And the new target. Eddie had prepared for this. He couldn't just redirect Klaus without giving him a target. That would be suspicious. The target needed to be valuable enough to justify the route change, but not so critical that Klaus would request additional support. American supply column, lightly defended. After taking the target, hold position and await further orders. The beauty of the lie was its modesty. Eddie wasn't promising Klaus a game-changing victory, just a minor military goal. Something believable. Something that wouldn't trigger Klaus's instincts that he was being set up for something terrible. Eisenfaust verstanden. Iron Fist 4 will execute order. Estimated arrival 5:30. Ende. Confirmed. Ende. Eddie released the transmit button and sat in absolute silence. His entire body was shaking now, adrenaline flooding his system in waves. He'd done it. Klaus had accepted the orders without significant questioning. In approximately 3 hours, 40 German tanks would roll into American minefields believing they were avoiding an ambush. But Eddie didn't feel victorious. He felt hollow. He'd just sentenced men to death. Klaus would die. His crews would die. They'd die believing they were following real orders, never knowing they'd been tricked by an American corporal in a frozen dirt hole. Eddie quickly buried the German radio under loose dirt and equipment, camouflaging it from casual observation. If anyone found out what he'd done in the next few hours, his life was over. But more immediately, the real tank group command would try to contact Klaus at 2:30. When they did, Klaus wouldn't respond because he'd already received his orders. They'd assume radio trouble. They'd try again. Eventually, they'd realize something was wrong. Eddie stared at his watch. 2:24 in the morning. In 6 minutes, the real German commanders would begin transmitting. In 3 hours, the minefields would explode. And somewhere between now and dawn, 300 American soldiers would wake up alive, never knowing they'd been saved by a voice in the static. At 5:32 in the morning, on December 19th, 1944, the first explosion tore through the frozen Belgian countryside with enough force to wake soldiers 3 miles away. Then came the second, then the third. By the time the cascading explosion stopped, 12 German tank vehicles had been destroyed, and the pre-dawn darkness glowed orange with burning fuel and ammunition. Klaus died instantly when his command tank triggered a teller mine. The blast punched through the thin belly armor and ignited the fuel tanks in a fraction of a second. He never knew he'd been deceived. Never knew the orders came from an American dirt hole instead of German high command. In his final moment, Klaus believed he was executing a real military move to avoid an ambush that didn't exist. 23 other German tank crew members died in the first 30 seconds. More would die in the hours that followed as American artillery, alerted by the explosions, rained fire on the trapped column. By dawn, the entire Eisenfaust battalion had been effectively destroyed, not by superior American tactics or overwhelming firepower, but by a voice that convinced them safety lay in the one direction that guaranteed their destruction. 2 miles west, 300 American soldiers woke to the sound of distant explosions. They grabbed weapons, manned positions, prepared for an attack that never came. When scouting units investigated at first light, they found the burning wreckage of a German armored column in an area where no fight had been planned or authorized. The information reports that followed were confused, contradictory. German tanks destroyed in American minefields they should have known to avoid. No evidence of American forces in the area. The Germans had simply driven into certain death as if following orders to do so. Some analysts suggested radio malfunction. Others proposed the German commander had suffered a mental breakdown. The true explanation never appeared in official documents. Eddie sat in his dirt hole and listened to the explosions echo across the frozen landscape. He didn't feel relief. He didn't feel pride. He felt the weight of what he'd done settling into his bones like the Belgian cold. He'd saved 300 American lives by taking German ones. The math was simple. The morality was not. Captain Morrison appeared at Eddie's dirt hole 3 hours after dawn. He didn't come with MPs this time. He came alone, carrying Eddie's taken notebook. The captain's face was unreadable as he climbed down into the dirt hole and sat across from Eddie in silence. Finally, Morrison spoke. Information officers found something interesting this morning. A German tank column destroyed exactly where your notes said they'd be, except they weren't supposed to be there. They were supposed to be attacking the fuel storage place. Eddie said nothing. The German radio we took from you is missing from the CI tent. Disappeared sometime around 1:30 in the morning. Morrison paused. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Corporal? Eddie met Morrison's eyes. No, sir. Morrison studied him for a long moment, then looked down at the notebook. These notes, this information, it saved lives. A lot of lives. He set the notebook on the dirt floor between them. But what you did, if you did it, was completely unauthorized. Pretending to be an enemy command is a serious crime. If the Germans had detected the trick, they could have found your position. You'd be dead. Anyone near you would be dead. Yes, sir. You put yourself and potentially others at risk for an operation that had no oversight, no backup, no permission from anyone with the authority to give permission. Morrison's jaw tightened. That's not heroism. That's recklessness. Eddie nodded slowly. You're right, sir. Morrison stood up, brushing dirt from his uniform. I'm writing a report stating that the German column was likely deceived by Allied psychological operations. I'm recommending you for recognition for your information gathering. He paused at the edge of the dirt hole. I'm also transferring you to a signals unit in Luxembourg, effective immediately. I don't want to know what you did or didn't do last night, but I never want to see you near enemy radio equipment again. Understood? Yes, sir. Morrison climbed out of the dirt hole, then turned back. Voss, those 300 men who woke up alive this morning, they'll never know your name. There won't be any medals or parades. This will never appear in any official history. Can you live with that? Eddie thought about Klaus, about the smoker's rasp he'd never hear again, about the men who died believing they were following their commander's orders. I can live with it, sir. Morrison nodded once and disappeared into the morning light. Eddie Voss spent the rest of the war in Luxembourg, far from the front lines, maintaining communication equipment and training new radio operators. He never told anyone what happened in that Belgian dirt hole. After the war, he returned to Milwaukee, married, raised 3 children, and worked for the phone company until retirement. He died in 1987 at the age of 64. In the decades that followed, military historians occasionally noted the strange fate of the Eisenfaust Vierer Battalion. Some guessed about psychological warfare operations. Others dismissed it as wartime chaos and coincidence. The truth remained buried in a frozen dirt hole, in a voice that spoke perfect German into the static, in orders that came from nowhere and saved everyone. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold tales of World War II's invisible heroes. Because sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns, but with courage to break every rule when lives depend on it. Eddie Voss never fired a shot in combat, but on one frozen December night, he fought the most important battle of his life, armed with nothing but a captured radio, 4 days of observation, and the willingness to become the enemy long enough to save his friends. In the end, war isn't always won by those who follow orders. Sometimes it's won by those who understand when to break them.